Hey, I'm Mr. MCP76, and in this video we're going to take a closer look to see how the 7900 XTX and Intel's Core i7-13700KF hold up against Outer Worlds 2 at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p with varying settings. We're going to test with ray tracing on, and we will also test with ray tracing off. Are we going to be able to hit 60 FPS or more with any of these settings, or is this game perpetually stuck under 60 FPS? We'll go ahead and test now and see how things go. Our first benchmark pass is going to be at, again, 4K, so 3840 by 2160p. We've got everything like vertical sync and motion blur, things like that turned off. Frame rate limit is set to unlimited. Ray tracing is on. We are not using any sort of upscaling in this test. We are going to stick with just TAA. We want to see the raw performance of the system. We're not really testing the performance of upscaling technology in this benchmark run. If you would like to see that video, I do have a video that I uploaded previously benchmarking the different FSR4 Int8 version of the FSR4 here against the 7900 XTX, the different upscaling methods. It's a pretty good deep dive, so feel free to check it out after this video. But for now, we're going to again test with just TAA, and our first pass is going to be with very high on all settings. Let's give it a try. All right, we're back in the game, so let's go ahead and give it a try and see how this goes. Now, not gonna lie here. We're not hitting 60 FPS with these settings. 4K, we're using 4K, TAA, and ray tracing, and everything set to very high. This is kind of just more of a baseline run to see what kind of performance the 7900 XTX can give us in this game with everything maxed out. Unreal Engine 5 is stuttering, which is not helpful in benchmark runs, but I guess that's part of the game, so maybe we'll leave that in there. I am choosing to slow down through about halfway in this run, just because when you go through the town, the performance seems to change depending on whether you're running or walking through the game. CPU utilization, the i7-13700KF definitely hit about 25% utilization there. The GPU is at 100% utilized, so at 4K you would expect the 7900 XTX to be fully loaded here. So nothing really too surprising except for the fact that it can't even hit 60. All right, so that concludes our first run here, and our frame times, we got 26 FPS average, 21 FPS for the 1% lows. And again, that was with 4K, running at 4K with TAA and very high settings and ray tracing on. Let's go ahead now and reset, and we'll go ahead and adjust the settings. All right, for the next test, we're going to actually adjust just two settings in the game here. According to Digital Foundry, there are two settings that really impact the game's performance the most. The first is going to be shadows. This is probably no surprise to many, as shadows is usually a pretty significant impact on CPU and GPU performance. And then the other one that we're going to reduce to high is going to be global illumination. So again, shadows and global illumination have been reduced to high. This is again via the findings of Digital Foundries as to the two settings that impact the game's performance the most. The others will leave at very high. All right, back in the game here. So we're going to go ahead and test 4K here, 4K TAA for anti-aliasing, and very high on all settings, but the two that we reduced down to high, which would be shadows and global illumination. Let's go ahead and try this out. Again, also ray tracing is on in this run. Let's see how it performs. Okay, let's reset because those stutters, man, they're so frustrating, especially in a game where you don't think that the look of the game, I mean, the game looks great, but it really doesn't justify, the look of the game doesn't justify those stutters. And this isn't Cyberpunk, and Cyberpunk doesn't stutter like this. All right, so we're in the 40s, so already doubled our performance by simply reducing those two settings in the game. We're at 42 FPS average. Set the counter. So 42 FPS average. CPU utilization is now in the 40% for the CPU. i7-13700KF is really struggling to keep up here, I think. You can kind of see that reflected in the GPU utilization, where the 7900 XTX was dipping down below 99%. We were like 98, 96%. So kind of looking like to be a CPU bottleneck here. I think Lumen's ray tracing, hardware ray tracing, still relies very heavily on the CPU. Maybe that's where these performance issues lie. All right, we've completed our run here, and we got a 41 FPS average, 31 FPS one for the 1% lows. So again, we've just about doubled our FPS compared to the very high settings with ray tracing. So pretty nice, about 20 or so FPS performance boost there. All right, so yeah, Digital Foundries I think did pretty well with that. Let's go ahead and try high settings across the board. All right, so that test was again at 4K TAA ray tracing on, and the two settings, shadows and global illumination, reduced to high, and that seemed to perform really well. Again, doubling our FPS from 26 FPS to about 41 FPS. So let's go ahead now and reduce the settings to high across the board. All right, back in the game. Let's go ahead and start our benchmark run and see how it does. Well, not promising. So we've reduced all the settings to high here. And honestly, not too much of a performance difference, guys. We're still getting about 47 FPS. So, we're looking at about, what, maybe 5 FPS better with everything set to high. So it looks like Digital Foundries was right on about those two settings being the most impactful. The others being reduced to high, not really seeing much of a performance boost. Again, about 5 or so FPS maybe. CPU utilization is though up into the 40s now, 38%, 39%. CPU utilization is pretty high. GPU utilization as well, going anywhere between 99 and 100%. It does dip down though, so again, coming through this town, it does look like we're still getting quite a bit of a performance loss going through the town. But FPS stayed pretty stable. Not hitting 60 though, but it didn't dip down into the 20s like it was before in our first run. All right, we finished this run and we get 45 FPS average, 34 FPS for the 1% lows. Not really seeing much of a difference there. I'd probably just stick with very high on everything and just reduce shadows and global illumination and call it a day, and then use upscaling to get us to possibly like 60 FPS. All right, let's go back and reset here to do our next test. All right, so our final test here at 4K is going to be with ray tracing off. So hardware ray tracing we're going to turn off. Now, as far as the settings, again, since we really didn't see much of a performance boost with high, I'm going to go ahead and set everything back up to very high again and reduce down shadows to high and global illumination to high, as we got almost the same performance with these settings as compared to very high. So we'll go ahead and run with these now and see the performance we get with ray tracing off again. All right, here goes our final test at 4K before we jump to the next resolution, 1440. So right now 4K TAA ray tracing off this time, and all our settings set to very high except for global illumination and shadows. So let's get this started. It's not looking promising. With ray tracing off, we're still in the 40s at 4K. So the GPU loaded at 100%. The 7900 XTX does seem to be pretty maxed out here with 4K resolution. We would really need upscaling to help us out here. And that's not too bad. I mean, if you give upscaling a try, you can see in my previous video, it'll get you above 60 in most scenarios in the game, except for apparently towns, villages, things like that, like what we're going through here. But right now, actively, we're, mid 40s, averaging 47. GPU utilization with ray tracing off is about 30%. For the CPU utilization, is about 30%. And the 7900 XTX or GPU is sitting at about 99% utilized. The i7-13700 KF, it's got a lot of its cores really maxed out, individual cores. So even though the overall utilization seems pretty low, when you look at the individual core utilizations, a lot of them are really high, even in this case in the 40s. And so It's a pretty heavy hitting scenario. 46 FPS average, 39 FPS for the 1% lows there. All right, so as far as 4K goes, I think in this case we can kind of say that whether you have ray tracing on or off, the resolution of the game is already going to impact it pretty heavily, and you're not going to get to that 60 FPS even with ray tracing, hardware ray tracing turned off. Might as well go with ray tracing on and enable FSR4. Especially if you have a 7900 XTX, you can implement Int8 version of FSR4 and probably turn that up to about quality or even balanced to get you above 60 FPS. All right, back in the settings, and now we're going to go ahead and test 1440p. All right, 2560 by 1440. We're going to leave everything else the same. The only thing we're going to do is we're going to turn ray tracing back on to start our first benchmark here, and we'll crank everything back up to very high. All right, ready to run at 1440p. So if you've got a 1440p monitor and a 7900 XTX or maybe the 7900 XT, let's see how the game performs at this resolution. Let's see if there's anything we can do to get us to 60 FPS, right? Maybe 4K was too hard for this GPU, but 1440p. All right, start our benchmark run here. And again, everything is set to very high right now. Hardware ray tracing is enabled. And the anti-aliasing we're using is just TAA. We're trying to avoid any kind of upscaler here to not taint our just raw performance of the GPU and the game. CPU utilization is sitting about 35% right out of the gate. GPU utilization is in the 80s, so the 7900 XTX is not having much of an issue running at this resolution. But again, if you look at the FPS at 1440p, we're not getting really much better than we did at 4K, at least when we're going through the town here. So this is with ray tracing on, so the GPU is not working hard, so if the ray tracing is impacting the performance of the game, it's going to be on the CPU level. We see a couple of the cores there at 50 or 60% utilized. Don't let that 25% utilization, overall utilization, mislead you. Some of those cores are almost maxed out, even with the i7-13700KF. All right, that's our run here. So we got about 39, 40 FPS average, 32 FPS for our 1% lows. All right, not too sure if that's maybe disappointing. I think it's a little disappointing. I thought maybe the performance of the game and the GPU was being held back by the 4K resolution. But as this shows here, this might be ray tracing performance that's holding it back. Let's go and do some more tests and see what we find. All right, our next test with 1440p, keeping everything basically the same, but we're going to reduce shadows to high and global illumination to high as well. All right, back in the game now, so let's see if now we can get to 60 FPS. I mean, we're at 64 FPS right now, but as we see, the town is where we really start to dip. So let's see how that changes. Let's go ahead and start our run here. So we already got about a 20 FPS boost again, just like we did with 4K. I mean, obviously this 20 FPS boost is going to get us into the 60s, which is better than at 4K, but otherwise kind of identical performance boost there overall. Ray tracing still enabled, of course. CPU utilization again about 40%. A lot of those cores now are in the 50 to 60% utilizations, and then the GPU is sitting at about 68% utilized. That's like 7900 XTXs. I mean, at this point, I mean, what else are you going to say besides that it's waiting on the CPU? And the CPU going through the town here really dipped down to the 40s. We started out at 60, going through the town back into the 40s. Really, this town, going through a town in this game really hammers it hard. So the question again is it hardware ray tracing? Is hardware ray tracing really bottlenecking our system via the CPU? Is it hitting the CPU really hard? Because again, now we're away from the town and our performance is back up into the 60s. So 56 FPS average, 39 for the 1% low. And that was at 1440p with shadows and global illumination turned to high, ray tracing on, and TAA. All right, let's go ahead and reset here and we'll get our next benchmark run done. All right, our next test with 1440p is going to be to set everything to very high. Or I'm sorry, set everything to high. All right, back in the game again here. Set everything to high now across the board. Getting just shy of 70 FPS here at our start of our benchmark run. You know, let's see if it maintains 60 plus FPS through the town. It always starts out well out here and then really goes to just trash after you hit the town. But let's see how it performs again here. Again, this is still with ray tracing on. Our next test will be without ray tracing, but let's get this final test run, benchmark run here done. Heading towards the town, you know, I mean, well, okay, there it goes. CPU utilization is up into 40s. The i7 13700KF is now in the 40% utilization, and GPU is way low utilization, and FPS is also way low in the 40s, which is basically identical to all our runs here so far. This is really becoming quite a theme here as soon as you start moving through the town. I mean, our FPS just tanks into the 40s. You just can't maintain 60 FPS even at 1440p and just high settings with ray tracing on. So now the question becomes, is it ray tracing? With 4K, you can make the argument that the high pixel count was just bottlenecking our GPU. The GPU remained basically at 100%. But 1440p, harder to make that argument. All right, so that was 57 FPS, 58 FPS average, 39, 1% lows. So quite the disappointing run there. I'm really curious now to see how much of an impact we get with hardware ray tracing off. Is that where the issue is, or is just Unreal Engine 5 broken? Let's test it. All right, back in the settings here now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did at 4K. We're going to set everything to very high, reduce shadows to high, and global illumination to high as well. And then we're going to also turn off ray tracing. Hardware ray tracing is turned off now. Okay, back in the game here with hardware ray tracing turned off. So basically using software Lumen ray tracing. And the run always starts out great. 70 FPS, you know, hey, maybe we'll maintain that. Why do I doubt that that's going to happen? Okay, we're actively getting about 80, above 80 FPS right now. Hey, maybe this is going to be it. CPU utilization is about 30%. GPU utilization is about 98%. That's actually not a bad balance, but let's see how the balance shifts once we're in the town here. Okay, now that we're in the town, CPU utilization has gone up to 36 to 40%. GPU utilization is about 98%, 97%. FPS is maintaining above 70, so far so good. CPU utilizations, I mean, you know, the cores individually are hitting 50, 60% utilized for the i7 13700KF. But still, I would say this is a pretty balanced run here. For 1440p, ray tracing off, everything set to high except for shadows and global illumination. Pretty balanced. We maintained above 40. All right, so coming to the end of our run here, so 73 FPS average, 56 for the 1% lows. So with that run with the 1440p, we can see that we were able to get above 60 FPS as long as ray tracing was turned off. Okay, our next test here is going to be at 1080p. And again, we're leaving everything else as it is. Now we are going to turn ray tracing back on here for our first run. And we're also going to set everything back up to very high. And Afterburner is ginormous now. Okay, so at least you can see the numbers easily. All right, so right now at 1080p, ray tracing on, TAA for anti-aliasing, and everything set to very high. I would say it's promising the start here at about 55 FPS. CPU is at about 28% load, and the GPU is at 100% load. Let's see how that changes. Is ray tracing going to nerf this run as well? I suspect it will. Let's find out. CPU utilization, again, is starting to tick up now. At 1080p, you'd kind of expect that. But let's see how, yeah, look at that. We're already down in the 40s. Basically almost identical FPS to what we were getting with 1440p and 4K. This, I mean, do you win points for consistent crap FPS or performance loss when going through a town compared to just being out in the wilderness? I don't know. And we're above 30 anyway, so I guess that's a win. CPU and GPU utilization basically unchanged. Well, I mean, the GPU definitely dipped down when the CPU was being loaded, but unchanged as far as what we're typically seeing in this game. All right, so that completes our run. So we got a 49 FPS, 33 1% lows. All right, so we weren't able to maintain 60 FPS, even at 1080p with ray tracing on. And to be honest, we kind of got the same performance when running through the town as with all other tests. Let's go ahead now and take our next benchmark run. So for our next benchmark run, what we're going to do is we're going to now adjust we're going to adjust these settings again, shadows down to high, global illumination down to high as well, at 1080p, ray tracing on, TAA for anti-aliasing. Let's see how it performs. All right, back in the game, already in the 70s, but again, apparently an easy location for the game to run. Let's go ahead and start our benchmark run here. 7900 XTX not hitting 100% or 99% load anymore, so it's kind of just twiddling its thumbs now and waiting. And what it's waiting on is the CPU, as it's about 38% utilized, the i7-13700KF here. A couple of its cores hitting 50 to 60% utilized. Coming through the town, we're watching our FPS already tank just as before. Really basically identical numbers. And just so you guys know, I'm kind of slowing down here to make sure that it's not me running through the town that's causing any kind of FPS loss or gains. So kind of trying to keep an even run here. So about halfway through the city running, halfway through the city walking. But it doesn't seem to be changing much in this case. As we're leaving the city, FPS is already starting to tick up. And yep, up into the quickly ramping up. And then once we're back out into the wilds, we are in the 70s. Now the thing is, it's not that the FPS tanks in the city. It's about 59 FPS average, 39 FPS for the 1% low. But again, it's not so much that the FPS is tanking in the city. You might expect that to happen with a lot more structures to add shadow and lighting effects to. So you would probably expect that you're going to see a performance loss going through there. The interesting thing is that the performance loss is almost always identical. Going through that town, we always see our FPS so far anyway, no matter what resolution we're at or setting, we're going to about 40 FPS average through there. All right, let's go ahead and test the next setting. So our next run, we're going to adjust the settings here. We're going to go from very high with just a couple of options turned to high to setting everything to high across the board at 1080p. Let's see what we get now. Can we maintain above 60 FPS with ray tracing on? All right, back in the game here again. So again, 1080p, everything's set to high and ray tracing still on. Honestly, not seeing too much of a difference here with the initial starting FPS. I'm not impressed. All right, let's get our run started. Again, GPU utilization in the 80% or so, maybe a little lower. CPU utilization is already at almost 40% utilized. Our FPS is in the 70s right now. All looks well. Ray tracing is on, so we're going to expect this to tank here in just, yeah, there it goes. All right. Okay, you know what? I'm going to say this much. This game, ray tracing is not broken in this game, you guys. And hear me out. It's not broken, because if it was broken, I would expect inconsistency through these runs, unexplained reasons for things dipping and spiking. No, not broken. This is consistent. This is bad game. This is bad game engine design. This is designed to run this way, I think. The optimization is needed here. Some serious optimization. Again, the ray tracing from Lumen here, the hardware ray tracing from Unreal Engine 5, relies quite a bit on the CPU. I think that's where we're running into a problem here, because the GPU doesn't care. It's not doing anything. All right, that was our run, and we got 58 FPS average, 39 FPS for the 1%. And if you're wondering, yes, that's identical to our previous run, so no change there. All right, let's go ahead and reset to our final test. All right, our final test here at 1080p will be to turn off ray tracing, hardware ray tracing. We're going to set everything to very high, except again for shadows and global illumination. As we saw, basically no difference between high across the board and very high with just these two ticked down. So why degrade the quality any further when it's not going to give you any sort of performance with ray tracing, at least with ray tracing on. All right, back in the game here for a final test at 1080p with ray tracing off. So now we're just basically using the software Lumen ray tracing here. 90 FPS, so really promising. Let's see how this goes. GPU utilization here about 90% utilized. And CPU utilization, a 13700 KF, sitting about 40% utilized. Really with ray tracing off, the system seems much more balanced while running this game. Let's see if that changes any as we go into the town here. And no, we're holding 70. I mean, the FPS dipped a bit, but we're still in the 70s. We're still in the 70s and even 80s at times. GPU and CPU utilizations fluctuating up a bit here as we're now rendering shadows and other effects from the buildings. But again, just about the same. And percentage-wise, I would say that they're they're well balanced with each other. 7900 XTX here is not having any trouble running this game. CPU is heavily loaded, but nothing that seems to be tanking the performance as we leave the town. We're getting back into the 80s and even 90s. In some areas, I'm sure we can even hit 100 plus FPS. But yeah, guys, I'm really, this kind of confirms it, right? This is ray tracing, not broken, but not optimized. All right, so our run here gave us 85 FPS average, 64 low. So the issue that we're seeing here is that the ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5 is not optimized well. Whatever it's doing to the CPU, it's not able to keep up. We were consistently dipping into the 40 FPS range when going through the town. Could not maintain 60 FPS no matter what settings we used until we turned hardware ray tracing off, at which point the CPU and GPU were kind of unleashed and allowed to do what they were doing. All right, so there you have it, our benchmark runs at the three different resolutions, 4K, 1440p, 1080p, testing with and without ray tracing and adjusting some of the settings. Really quite a disappointing result when we're looking, interesting, but also disappointing when we're looking at ray tracing and software ray tracing giving us much better performance. UE5, you got to do something about this. Can you fix it? All right, but that's our look at it. If you guys have any comments or input on the benchmark we did here or suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Hope you guys liked the video. Give it a like if you did, and we'll see you back in the next video. Adios.